Hello and welcome, my name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and speculating about the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 389, Train Control Improvements, posted by Kovrix and Clonan. Hello, trains are one of our favourite parts of the game. We already talked about the ways we improved trails in Friday Facts 377, so it's time to talk about how we improved the way you can control the trains that ride on them. Train schedule interrupts. The way you control the trains is very static at the moment. You have a list of stops to visit, and the train just goes through them one by one, and that's it. The only dynamic part is the wait time at each of the stops. There is no way to just go somewhere else dynamically based on what is going on. The most obvious annoyance caused by this limitation is the problem with how to refuel trains. In 1.1, you need to make sure that every schedule has a stop which also refuels the locomotives. For example, the iron drop-off station at the main base also has an inserter for reloading the fuel. But the more distinct routes you have, the more refueling stops you need. I confess I'm not entirely sure what they mean by distinct routes and more fueling stops. Yeah, I say basically. So I generally do what they talk about in the actual example they give, which is where your drop-off station, for example, which is usually either your main base or where you want to do smelting, or just as a systemic thing. So every time you drop off, you also refuel the train, or I guess you could do it every time you load up. But most people do drop off because that will generally be close to where you're doing smelting or your main base. That then has an inserter for loading fuel in. Obviously, when you get bots, you can use logistics to put things in chests and that sort of thing. But essentially, you're always still you've got to have a refueling place for every train line. And every stop, basically. Or every train line has to have at least one refuel place where it refuels on the stop. I don't quite know what the distinction they're making is with distinct routes. I do know, obviously, a certain amount of fuel, particularly if you're using coal, it'll only take you a certain distance. So if you have really long routes and you don't have, you have, say, 4 trains or something, then you can run out of fuel. And so you may end up refueling at both the pickup and the drop off. It is kind of boring and repetitive, and even more annoying when you want to change the type of fuel. The alternative is to have a dedicated refueling station and just put it into every schedule, but it also feels very wasteful. So, I would agree with the boring and repetitive. I don't know about annoying as such. As I say, I tend to, once you've got bots and once you're able to make, solid fuel and stuff like that, I'll tend to upgrade to a bot-based, system. And then, especially now that you've got the different ways of copying, remotely operating, for chests. But basically, you can just copy one chest and put it in, and just use, paste that recipe, as it were, that request in over the top. So you kind of have to do it once and then just, copy paste. It is a bit annoying when you're transitioning from using coal on belt to using that bot system. That means tearing a lot of stuff up. But yeah, I would definitely agree that it's kind of just the same thing over and over again. There's no real challenge to it, and as they've kind of been demonstrating, the quality of life stuff they've been putting in for version 2 tends to be more what would you say, edge casey, I guess, in that it tends to be stuff that an improvement, but it's quite specialised, or it's sort of taking away a pain that a lot of them actually are taking away a pain that they've created themselves, which is kind of what this is. In terms of the dedicated refueling station, I've tried that a couple of times, mostly when I was kind of early in my Factorio, playing career, as it were. I never found it all that particularly successful. The problem with it always is that it ends up, and it says, wasteful, and I would definitely agree with that. It often ends up gigantic, and it has to be able to service loads and loads of trains. You've got to manufacture all that fuel, so you either got to build it where you've got all that fuel being made, which can be a pain, or you've got to actually take the fuel there, so you end up with trains refueling your train refueler, which, it's just a bit annoying, basically, particularly when you've got a lot of trains and they're all kind of trying to refuel at the same time. You end up with lots and lots of parallel stops. So I've always ended up, as I say, just sort of refueling at the drop-off. I suppose there's also a wasteful aspect to it as well, that particularly if you say you've got a train that's going back and forth over one side of your base, and then you also want it to refuel, and your refueling's over here. It's got to burn a load of fuel to get to the refueling, and then burn a load of fuel to get back again. So it's not really often all that beneficial. The actual logic of what we would like the train to do is pretty simple. Do your stuff, and only when you are running low on fuel, go to the dedicated refueling station. Since this feels very natural, we implemented a new feature in the game which allows exactly this kind of logic very easily. We call them schedule interrupts. So this is a screen capture of the new GUI. We've got the actual sort of train menu on the left here, and then this is the sort of sub menu, the menu that pops up when you're doing an interrupt. We've got the usual fuel tab and the schedule and automatic, and that's all the same. And what they're setting here, they've got a pickup station for iron ore and a drop-off station for iron ore. And the conditions they've got are that it's full cargo and empty cargo. So that's all fairly normal. The bit that's new is right down the bottom here. So this interrupts is a conditional for the train, basically, so that when they want it to do something specific, the example they give with the fueling is that only when you are running low on fuel, it'll use this interrupt. And because that's the example they give, the interrupt is refuel, and they're just editing this to show us what's in the contents of that. The refuel interrupt has a condition on it and a target on it. The condition is basically, as reading this here, is that fuel, which is the coal, is less than 50. So in other words, the train has less than 50 pieces of coal in it. You can add multiple interrupt conditions to the one interrupt, and then the target, which is what the train will effectively do once that condition becomes true, is for it to go to a station called refuel, where it will fuel up until the point of the train having more than 100 coal, or it has sat there for 5 seconds of inactivity. Again, you can set multiple conditions. We've obviously got one here with an and, but you can also add extra stations. So it's not a thing they actually explain in the Friday Facts. This actually lets you do multiple things. So you could, in theory, I guess, have an interrupt that sends it to one place and then another place and another place, and it'll do those three in sequence, presumably, like it's got a sub railway menu, basically, or railway route on it. So it's very programmery. It's one thing I would say. A bit like I was a hooray when they introduced the changes to the, what do you call them, combinators, and made them much more like writing code. This is more like writing code. So this is an interrupt, basically, where in code you might have a particular type of condition where you sort of basically get it to try a piece of code, and if it fails, and it's not quite a good example of this, but if you try a piece of code and if it fails, then it'll do something else. Usually it will handle an exception, basically. So it's said, right, I'm going to try this. If it fails, there's something gone catastrophically wrong, and instead of the whole program crashing, it would catch that and say, right, what do I do if I find that it's interrupted? This condition, this problem has occurred. And it's a bit like that, where it's sort of saying, right, well, I'm going to keep doing this regular schedule, picking up iron ore and dropping off iron ore. But if my fuel goes below 50, this interrupt will kick in, and then I will go to a refuel station. They do explain it later on, but it then reverts back to its normal course, basically. So this is a condition that allows you to refuel a train only when it needs refueling, and makes dedicated fueling stops entirely valid and doable. Of course, there's nothing stopping you still using the old system. So you could still have inserters on your stops like you always used to, but this is giving you a much more different tools. The interrupts are very simple. You specify a list of conditions to trigger the interrupt and a list of target stations and wait conditions that will be added to the schedule. Whenever the train wants to leave the current station, it checks all the interrupts one by one, evaluating the interrupt conditions. If the conditions are fulfilled, the interrupt is activated and the targets are pasted into the current schedule as temporary stops. So one thing to note there, it does make it clear that it only checks those interrupt conditions when it's about to set off, okay? So when it wants to leave the station, it checks its interrupt conditions. I guess there may be different ways of operating it, maybe it's slightly more generic than that, I don't know, but it just wasn't explained in that way. But effectively, this refuel condition, you would need to set this so that the amount of fuel that it had when it got to a station, wasn't going to mean it would run out of fuel. So because you could imagine it turns up at the station and it's literally used so much fuel, it's gone from 100 down to say 10 or something. And when it's gone below 50, that doesn't trigger the interrupt as it's travelling. What triggers the interrupt is that once it's got to the station, done whatever it's going to do, it checks this and sees, oh, I've only got 10 fuel, go to the refuel. Well, if 10 is not enough fuel to get to the refuel, it's not going to get there. I say, it could be that actually it is more generic and you can have it be checking the interrupts, as it's travelling, but it doesn't say that. It says it only checks the interrupts once it's stopped, or rather once it's trying to set off. The available conditions are mostly the familiar set from the weight conditions: full or empty cargo, circuit condition, item or fluid count, etc., with some special additions that only make sense for interrupts. It was very convenient that we had already implemented the concept of temporary stations, which was used only for manually sending the train somewhere. For those who don't know, the temporary station is something like a one-time order. Once a train leaves the temporary station, the entry is removed from the schedule. So you can add those on, and I always get this like the wrong way around. If you hold down Control, and it might be Shift, but if you hold down Control and click on the rail when you're in a train and you're mousing over and stuff, you can add in a temporary stop. You can also do it via the menu, I think, which is the other one. It's like Shift and Control. I use it very rarely, like really, really, infrequently. It's if you wanted to do something like you've jumped in a train and you want it to take you somewhere, or perhaps you've ended up with a sort of a log jam of trains and you want to just get one moved out of the way, sort of thing. You can use it there, but they're temporary. So when it reaches the station, and I think there's a hint of them implying about this, but when it reaches the station, it and does whatever, and stops at that station. You can't add conditions to them, I don't think. You might be able to, I guess, but it's usually just like a 5-second wait time it automatically puts on, and it just then removes it from the schedule. So it's just literally using that functionality over again to add that interrupt in, and it's also adding in the more complex conditions for you when it does that. The free refueling example was the original motivation, but the way it works obviously has a much wider range of applications. The generic trains. Since the interrupt can have a cargo condition, we can make an interrupt for each type of cargo, saying where it should be delivered. So, for example, if you have iron ore, go to the iron ore drop. If you have copper ore, go to the copper ore drop, etc. The next screen capture shows this in action. We've got the usual train menu schedule again, but it's only got one proper stop. So the only proper stop it's got is item input. Item therefore being a generic term that it's got, because it could be anything, so it's just an item. And the condition is full cargo, so it will fill up with whatever it's got to fill up. And that could be anything. It could be iron and copper or stone, for example. And then interrupt has a whole bunch of different conditions. So we've got refueling, iron cargo, copper cargo, coal cargo. And the one that's been opened is the iron cargo. And we can see that the interrupt condition they're given is that the amount of iron ore is not equal to 0. So basically just a personal preference thing, I would guess, but you could put it as greater than 0 or something like that, but it's a non-zero amount of iron, and the target then will be to drop off the iron ore until you're empty. Now it's not clear obviously exactly what they're using it for in this particular circumstance. It is, but I'll explain it in a minute. They'll cover it in a minute. But basically, what they're doing is they're creating a generic system, basically. So item input can be every single outpost you've got. When you look at this, or when I looked at this initially, I was thinking this was like a mixed stop, a mixed ore patch. So and it's ironing, say, iron and copper and stone or something, all at the same patch. And so they're using it to basically sort, or not have to bother sorting the inventory. And I'm sure you could do that. But what they're actually doing is creating a completely generic system where all of their pickup stations for ore are just called item input. Okay? And therefore, any station that becomes open, maybe it's got a circuit condition on it for, saying the amount of fuel, amount of ore it's got in it is enough to pick up and that sort of thing. And therefore, when it goes open, this generic train, will go to any of those open stations. Presumably, it will do the same things of, picking the closest one and all that sort of stuff that it normally does. But instead of having a generically aimed iron outpost, you've now got just a generically named anything outpost. And it also go to the, one that's open and available and it's got a slot for, etc. And the conditions will each be the same. And what they'll be is that if it happens to have gone to an iron stop, it can now trigger this iron-based interrupt. Okay, so when the train fills up full cargo. It doesn't go anywhere. It's not got a target. Okay, but it then checks the interrupts, and the interrupt it knows it's fulfilling is the iron one because it's now full of iron ore, and so it goes, well, I've got a non-zero amount of iron ore. Let me go to the empty cargo inventory. Let me go to the iron ore drop. Again, a generic name, so there could be loads of those, and empty my cargo inventory. So then when it's at that station and it has emptied, that temporary stop will disappear and it will try to go to any item input, and that could then be coal, it could be copper, it could be stone, and so it's a completely generic system. It's effectively many-to-many, essentially, if you know anything about databases and logical arrangements. So we've gone from what the original system was, which was a kind of restricted many-to-many, because you could give things generic names, but your behavior was tied to the type of item, or you could get a bit fancy with it, I guess, and send it around, but it would be one-to-one, but because you could generically, you could name them all iron ore, it was technically many-to-many, but only for iron ore. Well, now it's proper many-to-many, that any stop can go to any stop, and it'll filter them according to what it is automatically. This means that the train with these kinds of interrupts is now able to deal with whatever cargo you throw at it. So it doesn't really care if it should pick up iron or copper or whatever you support with the interrupts. At this point, there is no reason to distinguish between loading stations, and as long as you use the train stop limits, you can now name all the loading stations the same and just use the one scheduled to manage all the things. Exactly what I said, basically. So you just give them super generic names of item, or you call them ore, or maybe, because one of the things this doesn't quite account for is differently sized trains. It sort of assumes that you're using, 1-for-1 train, or, exactly the same type of train on every single stop that you're doing. Because, you could set this up with actual plate, copper plate and, uranium and all that sort of stuff. Except, of course, you've got these, things of, well, uranium you need sulfuric acid for, and iron plate and copper plate you don't want going to a drop-off that is the same as the others. You wouldn't with that, would you? That'd be okay. But, you may, basically what I was thinking is you may be doing 181 trains for your iron ore, and you're doing 141 for your iron plate because of the 2-to-1 ratio. So that would still be supported. You could call them different, this could be ore drop or ore input, and that's obviously fine. And it could be plate input or something like that, so that it's the process stuff. One of the big advantages of this system is that all your trains are shared between all of the possible routes, so you don't have to think about copper trains are running low, or I don't have enough circuit trains, etc. There is just one big bag of trains, and you either have enough or not. And you could, of course, match the number of trains you've got to the number of stations you've got, +1 or +5 or something like that. So you've always got a spare train knocking about, or two, or sort of thing. And it does mention about you can use the train stop limits, basically, so you can have a circuit condition on it. Says, right, if there's more than X amount of iron ore, turn on. And you can still do all that and help to manage your system. Because obviously if it does this and none of these are open, because they've got trains there or they've got a condition set on them or what have you, then it'll just sit there waiting. It'll probably sit there saying no path. And they do come onto this later, but that would then mean it was blocking the station, which you wouldn't want. But as I say, there is a solution for that, they suggest. Well, that's what we're about to talk about. The depot problem. This is all very nice, but it kind of created a new problem, and it's the fluctuation of trains' availability based on all the unloading stations being backed up or not. This can lead to an excess of trains in the system when some of the resources or production is running low and we need a way to deal with it. So, we just added a special interrupt condition called destination full, which allows us to make an interrupt to send a train to a depot if all the item inputs are occupied, so it doesn't block the current station. So we then got the screen capture of the GUI showing this again, and it's basically what I was hinting at just a minute ago, where if the destination it's trying to go to is either not open or it's empty or rather it's not open or it's already got a train there or that sort of thing, then the train won't move. If you're doing this generic loading and unloading, you may want it to pick some other item up there or drop it off or those sorts of things, and if it can't go anywhere because there's no open stops, it'll just sit there and wait, probably with a I can't remember. Does it do destination full? I can't remember. But basically, it'll just sit there waiting for one of its interrupt conditions to trigger. And so instead of that, I mean, what you could do is you could set your refuel as your depot. I skipped ahead of what my speculation point I was going to do, but basically they've added a special depot-based condition, which is that the destination is full or there's no path and you're empty, basically. So they're saying if you've got nothing in you and you're completely, there's no those stations available or there's no path, because there is a station with that name available, but it's, you've got a mix of two-way and one-way trains or whatever madness you've done with your rails. Basically, the train can't go anywhere, and it's saying instead of sitting and blocking that station, go to a depot and then wait 30 seconds. That'll then turn off that condition, and it'll go back to trying to do whatever its generic one was. So the item input, and of course, if there's no station available now, or more likely another interrupt would kick in. But if there's no station available now, then it will just be blocking a depot, and you can just have loads and loads of depot stations, or as many as you want. Of course, if you plan your system so that it's 1-to-1 plus 1, so there's for every pickup there's and a drop-off pair there's a train, or maybe there's exactly one train per both of those, and you have just say one more or one less, then you probably wouldn't expect to see this problem cropping up, but it would mean that your depot could just be one train. What I was hinting at there is you could actually make it so that your refuel condition also has this condition in it. So your refueling place could also be your depot. You have like a logistical problem in the sense that, if you wanted to have a depot that had 50 trains on it, then, if you'd also need to fuel those 50 trains because, it's not going to make any distinguish between the stations. So they'd all have to have refueling on them. So that would be another slight workaround that you could put that condition on the depot rather than having a different interrupt, but then, what you're really gaining by that. If it was at the depot without any fuel, it would then just trigger it to go to the refuel station. One thing this does open up is my Clapham Junction style thing, because this could be your depot, your refueling place combined, or it could be your central rail crossing area or something like that. And with the new rail curves that we can do that are much more flexible, we can do like rail crossing madness basically, and have the trains all in a depot. Or another example would be a rail yard or something like that. You could set some bonkers thing up like this, this sort of thing, would be perfectly possible with your depot. You'd have just loads of stations, and the trains would come in. And now that we can do a lot of this type of curving, where we only had the one option before, we've now got lots of different curves that we can do. You can make some really awesome stuff, I think. So it sort of bodes well. I mentioned this before. What they've been doing has kind of killed off my aesthetic Factorio series, but it also opens up a lot more options and ideas that I could have for how I might build that. And particularly having funky stuff with rail. And here's a sort of another rail yard, for example. And these sorts of things where you can have, lines coming off of a longer thing. You can have that at the moment, but we can do it much more tighter, much more cleaner, and get this sort of effect going on. It's going to be a bit like playing with a proper model railway system rather than just, a logistic system, I think. Some people noticed a row of depot stations in some of our screenshots. This is what they were for. I can't remember whether I spotted that or not, to be honest with you. I seem to remember it. Whether I pointed it out in a video or not, I don't know. I remember seeing some with like a whole load of depot, and I had a quick through on the past Friday Facts. I couldn't see which one it was, but yeah, I mean, just explaining that sort of Easter egg, and it actually explains one of the other Easter eggs there was as well later on. Interrupts are global. Initially, interrupts were specific to each schedule, but we eventually realised that it is a really good idea to be able to share the same interrupt between different schedules. We had the problem where once we wanted to upgrade our fuel from coal to rocket fuel, for instance, we would have to go through each schedule and update the interrupt, which is not a big hassle, but often resulted in some trains not being updated. So we made it that interrupts are shared globally, identified by their name, and when you edit an interrupt, it changes for all the trains with that interrupt. This made it much more convenient and less error prone. So hopefully that's clear what they're explaining there. Basically, if you give the train, every train or each train or, Come on to groups of trains is another change that's coming. But if you call all the interrupts the same thing, then they're like global. So basically, this refuel, if you call it refuel, you could call it something slightly different, of course. Refuel science trains or something like that, because they're a different size and you want them to behave slightly differently or something. But basically, if you call it refuel, once you've defined refuel once, every time you call it refuel, it will bring up the same conditions automatically. And of course, if you change them then, so say you call it refuel and you've just realized now I want to upgrade all my stuff and you're doing a new train schedule, you can use that one that you're working on to change all of them at the same time. It's particularly useful for bug fixing, I think. If you've made some error, and you realise that as you're going through, you only need to click on one of them and update that one, and it'll apply to every single one that you've called the same thing. Really cool. Interrupt in interrupt. Normally, when an interrupt is activated, other interrupts won't be able to interfere until it is finished. But in some specific cases, this is too limiting. So we added another special interrupt condition called in interrupt. This allows the interrupt to trigger while another interrupt is in progress, which clears the original interrupt and replaces it with the new interrupt targets. There are some very specific cases where this is a crucial thing to have, but it is on a planet we didn't reveal yet, so more on that later. I don't know if this is why I wasn't sure. Above it says that it only checks the interrupts when it's at a station and, it's finished what it's doing, basically. So when it's trying to set off, that's when it checks the interrupt, is what it said. This, if that's the case, I don't quite know how it works, because it's only going to do the check, according to that previous one, once it's trying to set off. So when it's trying to set off, that's when it does the interrupt check. This implies that it's checking continuously, because how could it do the in interrupt if it got to the station, finished its job? It would need to check whether the in interrupt has been triggered at all times, because the example for that might be something like, it's difficult to tell because it's obviously clearly related to this planet. Let's guess that it's the hypothetical lightning planet. And what they're talking about is that your train station might be zapped by lightning, and that either destroys part of it or perhaps it can change the logic conditions. I hope it's neither of those, because those would be a bit of a pain in the bum. But what it means is that the thing it was trying to do in the interrupt becomes broken. Okay? I don't think this is really it, because in that case, the train would get to a point where it can no longer... Well, it sets the path for a train when it sets off. So it does recheck it. So maybe it could work, but it only rechecks it like when it gets stuck and things like that, and not when it's been waiting at a signal for a long time. So you could imagine a situation maybe where it's travelling to a second station, that station has got blown up, or the line has got cut, something like that, and so the train is going somewhere it can't get to. So when then does it check the in interrupt? It has to check because what it would normally do is get to where the station is meant to be, or the pathing would, repath would fail or something like that, and it would just end up stuck, basically. It wouldn't have anywhere to go. I guess what it could also be then is that it checks the in interrupts at pauses, like where it's at a signal and it's waiting to do a junction, or where it does repathing, it also checks the in interrupt, because it would still be in that interrupt. It would still be trying to go to that station even though it doesn't exist, and giving a no path error. And so this interrupt is basically there for when it gets that, it checks again, finds there's an interrupt that has an in interrupt, and then does whatever that new thing is, goes to a depot or something like that. So maybe it's something vaguely like that. So I don't think that's really it, because it could be no pathed, because it can't actually turn around or anything like that as well. So the in interrupt then would fail, because it's trying to send it somewhere, and it's one-way train, for example, and it's stuck, basically. So it's not actually really helping you, particularly if it's the track that's been destroyed and not just the station. So I suspect it's something different to that, but that was the kind of example I was trying to think through in my head. But yeah, it also therefore implies that it'll check interrupts at other times, even though above it said it was only when it was sat waiting at a station. Of course, both could be true. It could be that it checks it when it's sat waiting at the station and the interrupt kicks in for some other reason. I can't think what that would be. What it is like recursive code, basically. So it's like it's doing a code loop within a code loop within a code loop within a code loop. And I don't know how complex you could get with it, because presumably it's like a one-tier thing. Once it's in an interrupt, then it's just going to check that in interrupt. But you could then have another interrupt trigger when it's in interrupt. So you could certainly get a recursive loop, basically. Reservation Upgrade. All the more advanced interrupt schedule systems heavily depend on the train stop reservation limit. This is what prevents all the trains in the system trying to go to one stop. But there was one little problem with the system, which could even cause traffic jams or deadlocks, and which was made much more important with the generic schedules. If you not use the stop reservations, basically you can set it so that the train will have a fixed number of trains allowed at it, and that includes trains that when a train sets off, it reserves a slot in that limit. So the obvious example is to set it to 1, and you would never have more than one train trying to get to that station. People like me who use it tend to use it with logic, so it will count the amount of items in a station and only turn the train on or off or what have you based on the number of items that are there, because especially when you're doing these many-to-many or filtered many-to-many type systems, you don't want all of your trains trying to go to a stop with no iron ore in it, especially when you've got another iron ore station that has got stuff. So you try and do it so that if there is 2 trains worth of iron ore at a stop, 2 trains will turn up, and then the next 2 trains will go to the next stop that has stuff. You can't really stop the system from doing it for the closest. It will always try and path to the closest stop, which may or may not be what you want, but you then have to sort of start changing names if you don't want that to happen. And what they're saying is that basically this generic system can more easily cause jams and deadlocks, basically. Presumably, well, they explain it. So the problem is that once the train decides to leave the station, it instantly clears the reservation of the train limit, while still physically blocking the stop. This lets another train start its journey toward the stop, while there might not be enough space to wait without blocking the main line. So it feels a little bit like an edge case, and they do sort of say this in the next part, where they say, so we fixed it, so the train will only give it up its reservation once it leaves the block with the train stop. I'd be interested to know if other people encountered this problem in 1.1 as well. So basically what it's saying is, it was what the example I was giving earlier, that the train could try and set off, but it can't actually get to where it's trying to go, for example, or so the train could set off, right? And therefore it frees up the slot of the station it's just left. But perhaps there's a queue of trains. It can't get where it needs to go. And so the train that behind it, as it were, that is coming from another station and wants the slot it's just given up, it can reserve that slot as soon as the other train departs. But even if the train is sort of sat in the block, so it's sat there, waiting at a signal because it can't get out because there's too much traffic, the other train that's trying to come in might end up queued up behind it. And if that's where there are if that's where there are junctions, it would block potentially the junction, depending on how you'd signaled it. If you didn't have stackers, basically. And I could see how this would be a problem for travel times. If the travel times are quite short, your train could set off, and if it's nuclear fuel, it could arrive before the other train is cleared out. And then it blocks everything behind it and could easily cause a deadlock, because maybe that is also overlapping with your exit point, and so the train that was trying to leave ends up not being able to leave. It's a bit of an edge case, I think. And I say that comment kind of hints that it's sort of something you could probably have happen in normal game anyway, in 1.1. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if other people have had that problem. Train groups. The lack of train groups and the inability to edit multiple schedules all at once was annoying. But it wasn't that important before interrupts, because you didn't really need to update or tweak the existing schedules that much. But with interrupts and more generic trains, You need to update the schedules or interrupts of existing trains all the time, so this obviously had to be done. The approach is similar to what we did with another group changes in 2.0 update, logistic groups and interrupts. But basically, yeah, so we got this picture here of the example, where basically you're able now to set the locomotive and add it to a train group. And you can obviously have no group, but you can also have trains that do oil, trains that do artillery, trains that do coal, and they can have them. And I guess that potentially would also tie up well with if you were, if you had your, coal depot and your copper ore depot or something like that, then you could have all of them called that in the same copper group. And maybe you could tie it up with, copper plates, so it's just the copper depot and it covers both of those. Something like that maybe, depending on how you wanted to do it. It's kind of an interesting change, this, in that it's adding flexibility and kind of nothing more than flexibility. They're giving some examples of how you might use it, but it's just giving you a bunch of more options of how to play and how to do things. And a bit like some of the other updates, like the quality of life ones that I mentioned, they're not necessarily dictating how you use the thing. It's sort of, you can do this on, or even if you use it at all, it's sort of you can do it if you want, but you don't have to. You can, use trains basically exactly as you used to. You've just got this new option and play with it if you want. So any changes to the schedule of one member of the group will update the whole group. Importantly, this ignores the temporary stops, as they are part of the state of the individual trains. So hijacking a train to chauffeur you somewhere won't break anything. It only makes sense to show the groups in the train overview. Just to explain that part, it's basically just saying that if you've manually added a stop because you want to drive, you want to go somewhere on a train, that doesn't get added to the group, it's just literally added to the train. And here we see the train overview picture here, the GUI. This is actually this is a menu you can get up in game that I don't think a lot of players kind of know about. But basically this lets you see all of the trains. It still lets you see all the trains individually and all the stations. But now we've got the train groups, so you can look at all the trains in the iron ore drop. And it's not clear because they've chopped it off. But that would basically presumably see, you click that 11 and there's 11 panels here. And it's just the ones that are doing the iron ore. So now you can just place down a new train, set it to the group you want, and off it goes. If you have too many of one type, you can just reassign the trains group and turn it from an iron ore train to a copper train without hunting down an existing train to copy paste from. Really, really nice quality of life feature. And, also from an information point of view as well, and situational awareness, this is going to be such an improvement. At the moment, when you get a really big train system, it's really confusing to try and manage them. I mean, like really confusing, and you often have to just do it by trial and error of working out, I've got too many copper trains, or I've not got enough steel trains. So yeah, when you add a new interrupt to handle a new type of item, it will be added to all of the trains in the group, and everything will just work without any needless train schedule bureaucracy. Insert toddhoward.gif. Auto colour based on destination. This is another thing teased and noticed in previous Friday Facts. We like to colour our trains based on what they deliver. But with the generic system, any train can carry anything and static colouring just won't do the trick. Initially, we wanted to somehow add colouring to the schedule GUI, but it would be a hassle where every station entry needs to have yet another UI element in a GUI which is already not that simple. But we realised that a much more natural approach is available. So we added a simple checkbox, on by default, to the locomotive colour widget to change its colour based on the destination. And this is that change shown in the GUI. We've now got a tick box. When you're doing the cargo train, you can just get it to change the colour of the train to the destination. Presumably how it works is that, and I think this is kind of what this is showing here. It's a bit odd, but it uses a default. So you can set a default as being grey or purple or aquamarine or whatever you want. And then you tick that box, and therefore only when it's actually doing train destinations is it going to pick up that train colour. And here we see it in game. These trains are obviously going to a copper smelter, and we've already seen one train change colour and go. It now changes colour and off it goes. There is a bit of a pause in this, and I'm wondering if that's it doing the interrupt check, because it fills up. They stop, and there's a little pause. I hope that's because they've set a bonkers schedule or something like that. It's quite a long pause, if I'm honest, especially if you're getting a really, really big system. But yeah, I'm not sure about that pause. But yeah, so, really nice. If I'm totally honest, I'm not really a train colourer. I do it, but it's not really something that really bothers me. Partly, if I'm honest, because I struggle to come up with like properly distinct colours, and there is a thing on the wiki that it's sort of a suggested colour scheme. So maybe I'll start using that. But it's like, having 2 oranges for copper and like 2 blues or something for iron ore, as well as a blue for blue circuits, and red is the default colour of all trains, so what do you colour your red circuit trains? I just don't bother usually, but it's a nice little feature, and it'll certainly be helpful when you're trying to work out a train that's deadlocked or stuck or not going anywhere. If it's coloured itself in based on where it's meant to be going, then that could be quite useful. Yeah, I think these are grey because this station is grey. But I have to say, I'm assuming you can set a proper default colour to whatever you want, and then it will add that on. Conclusion. We have been asked to do something like logistic trains many times. Schedule interrupts provides a more generic system where logistic trains is just one of the things you can build from it. For example, you can have a system where you let the stop decide where to send the train using the circuit conditions and interrupts. It is also more approachable because you can use interrupts for just refueling or something simple while still keeping the normal schedules. We have been playing with this for quite some time, and it's one of those features we couldn't play without at this point. To clarify, this is a core engine feature which will be available for everyone with the 2.0 base game update. And more to come. We didn't stop there. We have more improvements related to trains prepared for 2.0, but we will have to leave them for another day. Let us know what you think at the usual places. Feels like they missed a joke opportunity there. They could have said interrupters at the usual places. Not that I'm exactly a comic genius, but yeah, feels like I missed a little trick there. There isn't a great deal to speculate about this in this Friday Facts. There's obviously what this interrupt of an interrupt condition would be about, but I did that as I was going through. I'm not smart enough, to be honest with you, to think of any wacky ideas. I guess if you are, that's a weird way of saying that, isn't it? If you've got any ideas, I would love to hear them in the comments. I say it's clearly related to one of the planets we've not talked about yet, because it says a planet we didn't reveal. So it's not Volcanus. There's not a sort of reason for using it on Volcanus, which leaves us the green planet, the lightning planet, the cold planet. Is that right? We got 3 others? There might be another one. Yeah, there's like a grey one, isn't there? Which we don't... Oh, I can't remember. Basically, that list of extra planets, it's usable on at least one of those for some very useful reason. What might that be? What else would there be to speculate about? I guess other features. I suppose it could be pathing or something like that. There's been improvements to pathing. One of the things that isn't really viable at the moment, I mean, you can use them, it doesn't matter, but sidings and things like that, like more dynamic pathing isn't really in the game. But it feels like that wouldn't change because, the reason it's like that is simply because of the computational overhead. It's way, 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 way easier to set the train's path when it sets off and keep it like that until it absolutely has to change, rather than constantly being dynamically checking it, which is what you'd need for crossovers and sidings and all that sort of an approach. I suppose it doesn't show nuclear on this list, which is interesting. Maybe the player's just not playing with it, but I don't know if that's because maybe there is something that is kind of hidden or extra related to nuclear. So I don't know if there's something related to that. It feels quite clunky at the moment with fluids, being transported around in the same trains as solids. So maybe there's some change coming there. I guess another thing could be like higher level trains. I'm kind of doubting that. One of the reasons they put in the elevated rails and things like that is to increase throughput that way. Having a sort of super train or amazingly fast train or something like that. I'm not sure. Would it count as an improvement or just a new feature? Oh, I'm thinking that if my speculation about the bioplanet being that it's very hostile, that's where all the new biters are, and it gives you the military stuff and all that sort of stuff. If that were the case, then there might be like armored trains or laser carriages or something like that to help protect your trains. I wouldn't necessarily call that. It does talk about it being improvements. Is that an improvement really? I guess that's up to your personal view on it, but it would be interesting to see like that. Another thing could be fuel. So it's they're not improving the actual trains or not giving us 2.0 trains, but instead there's a new way of fueling them or something like that. So I did just want to pick up something as well. I say I've not got a lot of speculation as such. I'd say we had our Christmas do last night. My brain is not fully functioning. Maybe I'd think of something if it was, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on what the extra things for train, the extra improvement is for trains that's coming. But as I did want to just pick something up. It's a bit subtle on the last week, basically. So in this screenshot where it's showing the save game files, we can see a series of chemical labs. Now they don't have Alt Tab on, okay, and the chemical labs do look identical, and that's kind of the clue. So they're not different models, right? But this chemical plant, you see it's got purple. I don't know if you can see that, maybe a bit too small. But you see it's got purple in that pipe. That means it's got petroleum in it, okay? And that petroleum is obviously being taken away. We've then got, I don't know why we've got a water tank, but we've got a water tank here because it's the blue colour. And so what this must be, because we're getting petroleum out, we're putting water in. What this must be is light oil. So we've got light oil cracking on, going on at this in these chemical plants, right? Now light oil cracking requires water and light oil, okay? And the water comes in on the left, as it were, from this point of view. Obviously, if you flip it round, it would be the bottom and right and what have you. It comes in any direction in a sense. But the order of them doesn't change. You can't change the order of them in vanilla. So if we look at this, I say the more important part, it doesn't in a sense matter which is which, but the more important part is that you can't connect the two together. So this here, you couldn't connect these two pipes. Assume these were all light oil cracking. You couldn't connect these two pipes together because it would be water and light oil, water and light oil, or water and light oil, water and light oil. And so you would then be mixing the contents of pipes. Well, I guess they could have forced it. You can do the flushing and all that sort of stuff, and it doesn't quite, let you do it sometimes and does sometimes, and it's a bit weird. But basically, these two pipes are connected, and these two pipes, or inputs rather, are connected, and these two inputs are connected. Now we know that's water, so we know that we've got a water side by side. Okay, so the top side here is water and the bottom side here is water. The top side here is water and the bottom side is water. This is obviously light oil, and then these two are light oil. This is light oil, and these two will be light oil. In other words, we're getting the functionality. I don't quite know how it's going to work. It must be a keybind to flip the inputs. We presumably also flip the outputs. But yeah, we're basically getting the ability to flip the connections, which is actually, it's one of these tiny, tiny little changes that is huge because, as you can see here, one of the things you end up having to do is always put a gap between your chemical plants. And that means you can't do simple, straight up beacons and get the same hit effect, basically. So, that's just one example of how this is better. And it's also just slightly organisationally a bit simpler and easier to understand, I would say. So yeah, that's just a tiny little thing that was, I didn't spot that myself, but somebody spotted it on Reddit and posted about it. Did I point this out? So when they were talking about the train change colour, no I didn't, did I? I didn't point this out either, but the thing they were referring to is Friday Facts 378, where they introduced the overhead rails, and you can see these trains changing colour. And I did a special little bit on one of the videos. They warp in, that's not part of it, but you see that changes there to white. Oh, there you go, that one goes to dark blue and then gold. This one goes to white. In fact, that one does a double colour change, doesn't it? So maybe that is a hint that actually interrupts are continuously assessed. Yeah, it changes from light blue to dark blue and then goes to orange. So interrupts must be continuously assessed? Interesting. I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you want to chat about the latest Factorio Friday Facts, then you can find me live streaming Factorio every Saturday on my Twitch channel at @TrisMagisters. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Hello. Hello. Hello.